During this session, we'll focus on the information you can find on pesticide labels and safety data sheets, also referred to as SDS. You'll be familiar with the old term material safety data sheets or the acronym MSDS, which you'll see is still used. You might have heard the terms label and labeling used interchangeably. They're actually different. The label is the document attached to the container or packaging. Labeling includes the label plus all the additional information and documents, such as the SDS, brochures, or leaflets referenced on the label or received from the manufacturer. It's a federal and state requirement that pesticide users read and follow all label and labeling directions. Both the label and labeling provide instructions to protect human health and the environment and achieve effective pest management. It takes many years and millions, sometimes billions of dollars to get a pesticide approved and registered for use in the United States. In fact, a pesticide can't be legally sold in the U.S. until the EPA has reviewed the manufacturer's application for registration and determined the use of the product doesn't present an unreasonable risk to humans, wildlife, or the environment when used according to the label instructions. But why does it take so long to register a new product? The manufacturer has to perform lab screening and tests to look at the pesticide's toxicity. They also perform field trials and research to study the efficiency, performance, and impacts of the pesticide in the setting where it would be used. All of the results and data are then sent to the EPA for review. The EPA studies this information to make sure the use of the pesticide doesn't present an unreasonable risk to humans, wildlife, or the environment. The EPA also makes sure the label language is clearly worded. One of the toxicological tests performed is the LD50. LD50 stands for the lethal dose to kill 50% of the test population, usually laboratory rats or mice. Toxicity when eaten is the oral LD50, and when it's absorbed through the skin, it's the dermal LD50. The LD50 only measures the acute toxicity of a pesticide, its immediate health effects. It doesn't provide details on the chronic or long-term effects. It only focuses on the lethal dose, and it doesn't tell you what might happen when people are exposed to 2 or more pesticides at the same time, or the cumulative effects of exposure. However, the results from the LD50 studies are extremely helpful, and they're used to determine which signal word is placed on the label. You're probably familiar with the 3 signal words on the label: danger, warning, and caution. As I just mentioned, the LD50 results are directly related to the signal word placed on the label, and therefore the signal word only tells you the level of acute toxicity. It doesn't give you a hint about the product's long-term health effects, whether it has the potential to lead to cancer, or its effects on the environment. This is not to say the manufacturer doesn't study the long-term health effects of pesticides. They do, actually. However, the signal word itself does not reflect the results of these long-term health effects studies. This table is very helpful. I'll just quickly highlight information you see in the first 2 and the last 2 columns to differentiate between the toxicity levels. If a label has the word danger in the skull and crossbones, it's a highly toxic hazard class 1 pesticide. The signal word is based on oral, dermal, or inhalation toxicity. A few drops to a teaspoon could potentially kill a person. A label carrying the word danger without the skull and crossbones is also highly acutely toxic. However, the concern pertains to its corrosive or irritant properties, which have the potential to cause permanent or severe skin, eye, or respiratory damage. Warning is the next toxicity category, and as you review the table, it's pretty clear. So let's just jump down to the last 2 caution categories. Caution, hazard class 3, is slightly toxic and has the potential to cause mild skin, eye, or respiratory irritation if used incorrectly, or if a person fails to use the PPE listed on the label. Caution, hazard class 4 are most often the products the general public can purchase to control pests in their home or yard. Many are pre-mixed or are formulated or designed in a way to prevent the user from coming into contact with the pesticide in its concentrated form. What's interesting about Class 4 products is the manufacturer doesn't have to place a signal word on the label, but they can if they would like to. Now, did you notice the numbers listed on the label? A smaller LD50 is more toxic than a larger LD50 because it requires less pesticide to kill half of the test population. You'll also see LC50 on this table. That's lethal concentration in the air, found in human health inhalation studies, and water, mainly for fish and aquatic life studies. As was mentioned earlier, field trials, efficacy studies, and performance tests in the actual setting where the pesticide will be used are very important. The company must have performance data showing the pesticide controls a particular pest or a group of pests on one or more hosts or sites, basically demonstrating it's a useful product. Efficacy studies include an untreated control group, which is extremely helpful when performing research. Researchers look at a pesticide's impacts on the target pest, the crop, the treatment site, other plants, bees, and other beneficial insects, as well as wildlife, livestock, and pets. They also need to make sure the pesticide won't present an unreasonable risk to humans, wildlife, or the environment. Safety measures to reduce risk must be clearly worded on the pesticide label so the user can follow them correctly. Information is also gathered on the crop varieties to which it can be applied, the application methods, rates, and the number of applications needed to control the pest. This is all key information for the safe and effective use of the product, and it contributes to details that must be included on the label. In addition, researchers study the pesticide's impact on birds, fish, and other aquatic life, as well as surface and groundwater. They also want to know how long the residues remain in the air, soil, water, and on plants. This is referred to as a pesticide's half-life, which we'll cover more thoroughly during the pesticides in the environment session. Expanding on the research even further, manufacturers want to know, what happens to the pesticide after it's applied? Does it break down easily? Does it degrade? Is it very volatile, changing quickly into a gas or vapor in certain temperatures or weather conditions? Would it have a tendency to drift from the target site? Does it move quickly through the soil or the groundwater? Does it move with water easily? In other words, how mobile is the pesticide? Another concern is how likely it is to move into plants from soils. And lastly, how long do the residues hang around and around and around? The manufacturer sends all results from their research to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA reviews all the data and determines if there's sufficient information to register the product. The EPA might require manufacturers to make changes to a label before the product can be registered and enter the channels of trade in the United States. There are 4 types of registrations and exemptions under FIFRA. They're referred to as Sections 3, 24C, 18, and 25B. Just referring to the sections by their numbers can get a little confusing, so I've included some memory tips below each description just in case it helps as you prepare for the National Core exam. The mnemonics might seem silly, but they might help as well. Most products are registered as Section 3, which is the most common or standard type of registration. Here's a memory tip. If you're struggling to remember Section 3 is the standard registration, think of 3 standard sizes: small, medium, and large. The first page of most pesticide labels has an EPA registration number. This number tells you it's gone through EPA's registration process and is approved for use in the U.S. There are some pesticides that are exempt from the EPA registration process. They're Section 25B products. This exemption only applies to products predetermined by the EPA to be of minimal risk to people and the environment. These products must meet strict conditions set by the EPA and only contain ingredients listed on the EPA's approved list of ingredients of minimal concern. All ingredients, active and inert, must be listed on the label. However, Section 25B products are not required to include an EPA registration number, establishment number, signal word, or personal protective equipment on the label. Think about car insurance rates. Once you turn 25 years old, rates are better because you've grown up, have a little more driving experience, and are considered a minimal risk to the insurance company. An emergency exemption, or Section 18, may be requested by a state if there's a serious pest problem for which there's no federally registered pesticide product. Section 18 registration is only issued to address an emergency pest condition in a state. The use for the site is not a federally registered use. A risk evaluation is done by the EPA upon a state's application for the emergency use. However, the review process is a modified review, likely with less data and in a shorter amount of time to allow the emergency to be addressed. Furthermore, all applications of pesticides registered under Section 18 must be made only by certified applicators and be recorded. Section 24C, or Special Local Needs registrations, allows states to expand or limit the uses of certain registered pesticides within their state. For example, to allow uses of pesticides for crops or sites not listed on the label. Others limit the uses of certain pesticides to address local concerns. Now let's take a closer look at a few sections of the label. Some of the sections we'll just touch on briefly in this session, and we'll cover them in more details in other sessions. Take a moment to look at this label. Question: who can purchase, use, and directly supervise the use of this product? The answer is certified applicators. What piece of information or section on this label clues you into the fact that only certified applicators can use, purchase, or supervise its use? The answer is the restricted use box at the top. Restricted use pesticides, often referred to by the acronym RUP, are those pesticides the EPA has determined to have the potential to cause harm to people, wildlife, or the environment if used incorrectly. Therefore, only certified applicators, people who take and pass the necessary certification exams, are authorized to purchase, use, or supervise the use of RUPs. If a pesticide is classified as restricted use, the label will include a restricted use pesticide statement in a box on the very top of the first page of the label, as seen in the two labels on this slide. Note there isn't a direct correlation between the signal word and whether or not the pesticide is an RUP. One label has caution, the other danger, poison. Remember, the signal word pertains to the potential acute toxicity to humans if exposed to the pesticides. You might work with an RUP product that has the potential to negatively impact groundwater or surface water, but it's only mildly acutely toxic to humans and therefore carries the word caution on the label. Other pesticide products are classified by the EPA as non-restricted or unclassified use pesticides. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to them as general use. These pesticides present little hazard to man or environment when used in accordance with the label directions. If you look at the two product labels on the screen, you'll see they don't carry the RUP box we just saw on the previous slide's labels. Now let's talk about the name of the product. If you ask 3 people what pesticide they're using, one might say, "I'm using Roundup." Another might call it Roundup Original, and another might just say glyphosate. Unfortunately, there are also people who can't remember the name of the product they're handling, and they just say, "I'm using a generic Roundup." So we'll go ahead and identify the difference between the trade name, brand name, common name, and chemical name on the next couple slides. We'll jump back to this Tame label and use it as an example. The trade name is Tame. How can you remember this? See the registered trademark symbol, the R inside the circle? The trade name is the name up until you see that symbol. That should be a pretty easy way to differentiate between the brand and trade names. The entire circled area is the brand name, Tame 2.4 EC Spray. For example, since many of you are familiar with the Roundup products, Roundup is the trade name, and Roundup Pro, Roundup Weather Max, Roundup Quick Pro, etc. are examples of the brand names. Next, let's look at the difference between the common name and the chemical name. Now that it's circled on this slide, it becomes a lot clearer to understand. The common name is phenproperthin, and the chemical name is everything you see circled in green. An easy way to differentiate between the common name and the chemical name is the chemical name is much longer and it describes the chemical, just like something you'd see in chemistry class. When a label has an Ag Use Requirements box, you'll automatically know it's been approved for use in agricultural production areas. If you work in ag production, you're most likely familiar with the Worker Protection Standard, a requirement to provide application information, training, decontamination supplies, and PPE to people who work directly with pesticides or in areas where pesticides have been used. If you use a pesticide for ag production, you must also comply with the WPS. If you look at the information inside the yellow boxed paragraph of the Ag Use Requirements section on this slide, you'll see the reference to Worker Protection Standard. You'll often find restricted entry interval information in the Ag Use Requirements box as well. The REI is the time you must wait after the application is complete before it's safe to re-enter the area without protective equipment. Sometimes additional REI information is listed in the Directions for Use section if there are commodity or site variances. Just to give you an example, you might have a longer REI for a pesticide when you apply it to tomatoes grown inside a greenhouse than you would if you applied it to tomatoes grown out in the field. If someone needs to enter the treated area during the REI, they're referred to as early entry workers, and they must be provided with and wear the PPE required for early entry. This could be different from PPE items needed for mixing, loading, or applying. If you'd like additional details about the WPS requirements, you can find a lot of information and resources on the EPA website, epa.gov, as well as the Pesticide Education Resources Collaborative website, pesticideresources.org. Please take a look at your product label handouts again. Question: who has a label with a non-agricultural use requirement box? This box will be included on labels for products registered and approved for use in areas that are not agricultural production areas, such as landscape areas. Some product labels have both an Ag Use Requirement box and a non-Ag Use Requirements box. If you work for a golf course, you might refer to both of these. The Ag Use box in the area where you grow sod as replacement turf, and the non-Ag Use box for herbicide spot treatments to control weeds, along the paths and parking lots, for example. Notice the variation in the REI information on the screen and/or on the labels you received as handouts. The example on the screen states to stay out of treated areas until the sprays have dried. The following two slides highlight sections containing details we'll cover more thoroughly during other sections. This slide shows the label also includes PPE requirements, user safety recommendations, and environmental hazards. These three sections, PPE, user safety recommendations, and environmental hazards, contain instructions that could be considered either mandatory or advisory. Mandatory statements include those that you must do. Advisory statements are things that you should do to reduce risks. Let's look at PPE for example. Is the list of PPE only a suggestion, or are handlers required to wear all of the items listed when working with a pesticide? It's a required list and is therefore mandatory to follow. Which of these would you consider mandatory, and which of these are advisory? Users should wash hands with soap and water after handling and before eating, drinking, or chewing gum. Answer: advisory. Do not apply directly to water. Answer: mandatory. This slide shows three additional sections: first aid, directions for use, and storage and disposal. Note that there can be advisory and/or mandatory wording in each of these sections of the label. After learning about the different sections of the label and the key safety and use information included in each section, it's easy to understand why it's important to read the label before buying a pesticide, mixing or preparing the pesticide you'll apply, applying the pesticide, or storing or disposing of the pesticide or its container. Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDS, are now called Safety Data Sheets, or SDS. Safety data sheets are provided by the manufacturer for all pesticide products. SDSs provide detailed safety information. Your pesticide seller might provide them to you, or you can find them online through the manufacturer's websites. However, make sure you're accessing the correct and the most up to date version of the SDS. The document contains valuable information, most of which is not included on the label. The following slide includes a list of the various sections of the SDS. Safety data sheets must be kept in a central location and be easily accessible to employees. The new format of the SDS is divided up into sections. The format is consistent and therefore makes it easy to find the information quickly if you're familiar with the layout in different sections. Unfortunately, most pesticide handlers work strictly with the label and never review the SDS, which is usually stored in a large binder in the shop or break room. It's understandable people wouldn't have time to peruse through the SDS binder. However, it is important to know that the SDS contains very important information you won't find on the label. There's some overlap, such as first aid, active ingredient, handling, and storage information. If you'll notice on this slide, the SDS contains information for firefighters and other first responders. You can get more specific details about the physical and chemical properties of the product, toxicological information, such as the potential long-term health effects of exposure, and carcinogenicity.